I'm a 42-year-old office worker named Tanner. 10 years ago, I divorced my wife because she had an affair. I'll be telling you that story today. At the time, I was 32 years old. My wife, Sydney, was 28 and was a housewife. We had been married 5 years, and I began to want kids. My wife became distant, wore fancier clothing than usual, and began going out often at night. She would get home very late, and sometimes she wouldn't return until morning. I felt very uncomfortable and was obviously against her nightlife. I couldn't hold myself back anymore and look through her phone. She had a password on her phone, but she's been using the same password since before we got married, so it was easy to crack. She hadn't deleted any of her texts and had videos and photos saved of her together with a man I didn't recognize. She's been making a fool out of me all this time. Holding back the urge to throw up, I continued to look through her phone and saw that her calendar app had little pins on some days. I had taken note of the nights that Sydney spent away from home, and those were exactly the days pinned on her phone. She had pinned nearly every day on her calendar, including our anniversary and my birthday. "Congrats! Please continue to take care of me," is all she texted me on those days, while she was secretly out with that man. Looking at her schedule, I understood that her affair has been going on for at least a few months now. I considered why she might have done this, and had a good idea. A few months back, I was super busy at work, and even had to go to the office on the weekends. I'm sure that made my wife feel lonely, which must have pushed her to have an affair. In her text to that man, whose name I found out was Kenneth, Sydney would profess her love to him, and they'd both insult me. She even said she wanted to divorce me and get remarried with him. She had completely fallen for him. Seeing those texts, I felt like my heart was getting shredded apart. I love my wife from the bottom of my heart, but she didn't feel the same way about me. I went to the toilet and threw up, and then sat on the floor and cried. I felt desperate, and was at a loss about what I should do. From then on, I changed. I adjusted how I worked so I could get home as early as possible, and I would offer to help out around the house. I spoke more to Sydney and put in effort to keep our conversations engaging. At first, Sydney reacted coldly and would ignore me often, but I wouldn't give up, and even convinced her to go on trips together with me, even though she was against it at first. I would take her to the movies, or on day trips on the weekends, and made sure we spent as much time together as possible. I got her a surprise present for our anniversary, and cooked for us. All in all, I desperately did all I could for her every day, but she still continued cheating on me. I knew she was still seeing her lover, but I continued to put an effort into our relationship. Eventually, as a result, she began to pay more attention to me. She smiled more when we spoke, and would cook together with me. She would plan what we'd do on weekends, or where we'd go on vacation, and she would talk to me more often. I felt like the distance between us had become much smaller. One day, I had to wait a long time at work, so I bought a magazine to pass the time and ended up bringing it home with me. When Sydney got out of the shower and first noticed the magazine, she nervously looked between it and me. I wondered what could be wrong. But then I remembered that there was an article in the magazine about women cheating. She probably saw that written on the front cover. Sydney asked me, "What would you do if you found out I was having an affair?" My heart tightened up. If it's already happened, but I smiled at Sydney. "There's no way you would cheat." In a joking voice, she replied, "You never know." I answered, "I do know. You wouldn't because I trust you." At that moment, Sydney's expression became stiff. I continued speaking. "Honestly, I don't know if you consider me a good husband or not, but I really care about you from the bottom of my heart. I love you, so of course I trust you." Suddenly, Sydney burst out in tears. Her voice choked up with sobs, and she said, "Me too." Sydney then began to change. Though I still felt bad about doing it, I continued to peek at her phone. She used to meet her lover every week, but now she barely met him 3 times a month. Seeing that change, I felt very happy. I trusted that if things continued like this, she'll give her heart back to me. And, as I hoped, Sydney began expressing her love for me more. I took Sydney back from her lover and managed to rebuild our marriage. At least, that's how things seemed. At that time, my wife didn't know. All of this was just preparation for my revenge. Believing her, loving her, that was all a lie. She had texted Kenneth that she won't use birth control with him, and if they have a child, she'll make me take care of it. How could I trust someone like her? The love I used to feel for her, I flushed that down the toilet when I threw up after first looking at her phone. All that was left in my heart was a desire for revenge. From that day, when I first found out, the only thing I've thought about is how I will send Sydney and her lover to hell. It's true that I used to love her. It's also true that when I found out she was cheating, I thought it was my fault. But when I looked through her phone, it was too late. Seeing that she pinned all the days she met him made me feel so gross. At that time, I decided I would use all my power to make sure those two idiots get their payback. I photographed and copied all of Sydney's photos and messages. She met him just about every day, so I knew that if I hired a private investigator, they'd easily be able to collect evidence. All she did to not get found out was put a password on her phone, but it was such an easy to guess password that she must have thought I was really stupid. If I suddenly showed her the evidence I had, I was sure Sydney would just make fun of me and happily go on to be with her lover officially. Of course, I planned to sue her for alimony, but I didn't think that was enough karma for them. No matter what it takes, I wanted my wife to cry and beg me not to divorce her, so that I could laugh in her face. How could I accomplish that? The idea I came up with was simple. I just needed to make my wife love me again. My battle began from the day after I discovered her affair. All I felt for Sydney at this point was hatred, but so that she wouldn't find me out, I continued to suggest we have sex. She usually turned me down, but the time she accepted really felt like hell. I hated touching her, but I couldn't avoid it when I was the one suggesting we have sex. Every time we'd finish, I'd go to the bathroom and puke. My body completely rejected hers. Around that time, I also hired a private investigator and collected evidence. Within less than a week, the private investigator contacted me, saying he had gathered enough evidence. It was honestly funny. The private investigator even said, "If every client was like you, my job would be easy." I requested he extends his investigation and collected even more proof. It cost a pretty penny, but I didn't mind. I planned on getting it back from Sydney and her lover after anyway. I also looked into Sydney's lover. Kenneth was the same age as her, 28 years old. He worked for a pretty big company, and his wife was beautiful. My wife was below average looking, so I couldn't help but wonder what he would like about her after he was married to someone so beautiful. All that time, I continued kissing up to her. During the day, I would set up voice recorders around the house, and at night, I would listen to the recordings. My wife spent most of the day outside of the house, so going through the recordings was easy. I had recordings of her phone conversations and their sexual encounters. Sydney and her lover really enjoyed making fun of me. "That idiot suggested we have sex last night, but I turned him down. He'll have an affair soon. I need to start planning how much money I'll claim from him in alimony." I couldn't help but laugh when I heard that recording. "You're the one who'll be paying me." It felt like a big game. I knew I had no feelings left for my wife, but through my daily efforts, my wife's attitude towards me began changing slowly. She would laugh during our conversations and enjoy going on trips with me. Her meetings with her lover drastically decreased, and they began to argue more. Her heart was definitely turning towards me again. That meant it was time for the final stage of my plan. I bought and brought home a magazine that mentioned marital affairs and left it on the dining table so that she'd see it. My wife loved magazines, so I knew she'd look at it. If by chance there wasn't a magazine that had an article about cheating, I would try to bring it up during a conversation. Sydney asked me, "What would you do if you found out I was having an affair?" Just as I had planned. And when she said that, I strongly told her that I trusted her and professed my love. Then, when Sydney said she loved me back between tears, it was incredibly difficult to hold back my laughter. A few days later, my wife, parents, in-laws, and I all gathered to have dinner together. This was all according to my plan. We were having dinner at my parents' house, and it was peaceful. Suddenly, I began to cry. My eyes wouldn't tear up, so I slumped my head down and shook my shoulders. Seeing me suddenly start crying, everyone was bewildered. My father-in-law was the first to ask, "Tanner, what's wrong?" My mother-in-law handed me a tissue out of concern. I apologized, and accepting the tissue, I finally looked up. "I'm sorry for being so worked up. I'm having so much fun with everyone, so thinking that this will be the last time." Surprised to hear what I said, my mom asked, "What do you mean the last time?" I stopped pretending to cry and nodded. "I'm sorry. I'll be divorcing Sydney." Everyone was dumbfounded. The look on my wife's face was especially priceless. Then they all began questioning me in a frenzy. Looking over at my wife, I pulled out an envelope from my bag. Sydney had been acting weirdly for a while now. Doubting her was hard on me, so in order to trust her again, I did a bit of an investigation. This was the result. I pulled photos out of the envelope and laid them across the table. Everyone looked at the photos and froze. There was nothing they could say. They were photos the private investigator had taken of Sydney out with her lover. Among all the photos I had received, those were the best ones, that clearly showed their faces, even though they were taken at night. Cameras these days really are amazing. Suddenly, Sydney screamed out, "No!" My father-in-law exploded. Knocking Sydney over, he got on top of her and began slapping her. My mother-in-law's face had gone pale. "What? How could you?" she mumbled to herself over and over. My parents came to their senses and stopped my in-laws, and I began to pretend to cry again. It was chaos. But after a while, everyone calmed down a bit, and we began to talk. The mood in the room was somber. My in-laws were stunned. My parents were silent and made colder faces than I had ever seen them make before. I thought I didn't need to act anymore, so I stopped pretending to cry and returned to my normal blank face. With a face swollen from tears, Sydney swore, "No, that's a misunderstanding." Without thinking, I laughed. "How could you say this when I have such obvious photos?" Sydney continued to repeat. "No, you're wrong. No." With no choice, it was time to take out my hidden card. I pulled out my cell phone and made a call. "Hello? It's Tanner. Excuse me, can you come now?" I hung up the phone and everyone stared at me blankly. A little while later, Kenneth, his wife, and his parents came to my home. When my family saw them, every single person froze in place. Everyone who arrived, except for Kenneth himself, got on their hands and knees to apologize. His wife said, "I'm sorry for all the trouble my husband has caused you." I replied, "It's not your fault. You don't need to apologize." "No, his unfaithfulness is my responsibility," she answered back, pressing her head against the ground. Next, his parents joined in with the apologies. "How can we make this up to you?" After repeating to everyone to stand up, I finally got up. Kenneth stood unmoving, as he had been earlier. The expression on his face looked completely fine. At that moment, his father turned on him. "You should get on your hands and knees and apologize as well." His father smashed his face into the ground. With blood dripping from his nose, Kenneth began half crying and trembling and apologized to me. When she saw that, Sydney's face turned blue and she began to tremble as well. It was lovely to watch. A few days earlier, I had gotten in contact with Kenneth's wife. When I showed her all the evidence I had gathered, she began to cry. At home, he didn't act like he was having an affair at all, so she just thought he was busy with work. She assumed he was returning home late every day from work, so she even admitted how hard-working he was. How pitiful. She trusted her husband so much, but he was messing around with my wife. I waited for her to calm down a bit and explain my plan to her. I asked her to come over to my house today. Our huge meeting began. Sydney and her lover went back and forth saying excuses, but every time they said something ridiculous, one of their parents would hit them and tell them to say the truth. It took a while, but finally we more or less understood how everything began. The two of them first met a year and a half ago. It began when he catcalled Sydney out on the street. At first, they just chat with each other secretly, but when Sydney and I stopped getting along, she began meeting him nearly every day, and they became friends with benefits. Kenneth and his wife's relationship stopped being romantic. It was clear that the ones here who loved their spouses were Kenneth's wife and I. I took out the voice recorder I had. On it, Sydney said, "I love you, Kenneth. I don't need that useless man anymore." Kenneth replied to her, "I also love you way more than my wife. I will divorce her and the two of us can have kids together. Let's get married." I had gone through all the recordings I had and chose the most shocking one to play here. When they heard that, Kenneth's face turned from blue to green, and Sydney let out a high-pitched scream. At the same time, their parents began hitting them again. We watched this scene unfold for a few minutes, and when we started talking about the most important topic of the day, Kenneth's wife stared at him with spite in her eyes. "I'm sure you get it by now, but we can't stay married any longer. Let's divorce." In a flustered voice, Kenneth said, "Wait!" But his father punished him with an iron fist. "Just shut up and nod." I began to speak. "Well, let's also make things clear. We're also getting a divorce." Sydney screamed, "No, that's the last thing I want us to do. I really love you. I know how much you care for me. I don't care about Kenneth anymore. You're the only one for me." I let out a sigh. There's no way I can believe that. In a wailing voice, Sydney continued to desperately complain. My parents and in-laws stared at Sydney with a cold look in their eyes. No one trusted her. I was the only one who knew that those were her true feelings. All the effort I put into my wife recently was all for this moment. I knew that my wife loved me again, but seeing that, I threw her away. Sydney clung to my legs and apologized. I looked down at her coldly and felt great. I felt my hatred leaving my body. Now, I just felt refreshed. I'm sure my facial expressions at that moment was inappropriate. The discussion that followed was exhilarating, but difficult. Kenneth, his wife, and his parents left our house. They were going to continue their discussion at Kenneth's parents' house. "We will definitely pay you compensation for this in a lump sum." Kenneth's father-in-law promised that with the condition that I don't take them to court. I agreed, and with the help of my lawyer, I drafted and sent them a memorandum for the alimony. Kenneth and his father signed that document, and my business with them came to an end. The problem was Sydney. She was honestly on the verge of madness. She remained slumped down, in a daze. Tears followed down her expressionless face, and if someone began talking about the divorce, she would scream on the top of her lungs. Why is she acting like the victim? I had no choice, so I discussed things with her parents instead of her. They said about the same things as Kenneth's parents. My father-in-law apologized to me again. "No matter how much compensation you ask us for, we will pay it. I will make sure of it. But please don't sue us. There's nothing I can do about her being my daughter." I agreed with him. When it came down to it, I was satisfied just seeing Sydney's reaction to all of this. As long as they paid me back the money I spent on my private investigator and lawyer, it was fine by me. A few days passed. I visited Sydney's family's house and they signed the compensation memorandum I had drafted for them. We also managed to fill out our divorce papers. Shortly after, I received all the compensation I had requested from Sydney and Kenneth. Sydney and I didn't divide our property upon our divorce, and she paid me for all the expenses I had accumulated these past few months. In addition, I had her buy out our furniture and home appliances, so in total she paid me around $35,000. I took $60,000 from Kenneth. I thought everything was over now, but a new problem arose. Sydney began stalking me. I called her parents to pick her up every time I discovered her, but she wouldn't stop. I was super annoyed, so I quit my job and moved. Luckily, I found myself a new job quickly. My salary was a bit lower than before, but I enjoyed the work more. Of course, I didn't tell Sydney about where I moved. I didn't even tell my own parents. I changed my phone number and only called my parents when completely necessary. 10 years passed. I have no contact with my wife and things have calmed down, but maybe the revenge against my ex-wife was too effective. Sydney became a stalker and I had to move to run away from her. My ex-in-laws had to deal with a lot of heartache because of her, and she causes them trouble when she's at home. They had always treated me well, so I did feel bad about that, but I was very satisfied to have cut off my relationship with Sydney. Kenneth and his wife also divorced, and I've heard his parents disowned him as well. Kenneth's ex-wife claimed a lot of money from him in alimony, and to pay it off, he had to take on a lot of debt. I'm sure he's going through a lot now. I heard this all from Kenneth's ex-wife, who I happened to meet coincidentally. 10 years had passed since this all happened, so I was surprised to see that she was also still single. Was it good that she split from him? She did seem energetic and beautiful. She actually invited me out for dinner, which was when she told me what had happened with Kenneth. I don't know what will happen from now on, but I guess I'll just have to wait and see. Thank you for watching. Did you enjoy this video? If you did, please check out our other videos and subscribe to our channel below.